Okay. Very good afternoon to you, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to NUS School of Computing. I'm Gary, and I'll be chairing this afternoon's session. As part of our school's 10th anniversary celebration, together with Google, we are proud to bring to you our special speaker, Dr. Vint Cerf, Vice President and Chief Evangelist of Google. Dr. Cerf holds a BS from Stanford and a PhD from UCLA, and in the 70s, as you know, co-designed the TCP/IP protocols with Robert Elliott Kahn. Incidentally, as a piece of trivia, that was roughly the same time when our school was starting out as a fledgling department in the Bukit Timah campus, some 33 years ago. For his work on the internet, he has won numerous awards, including the ACM Turing Award and the US Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian decoration bestowed by the President of the United States. Now, trying to tell you more about our speaker will be a disservice to you, as I'm sure you're all dying to hear from him. Besides, our speaker really needs no introduction. So without further delay, I can call upon Dr. Vint Cerf, father of the internet, to share with us the tracking of the internet into the 21st century. Dr. Cerf, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate everyone taking an afternoon off so we can have a chat on Friday afternoon. At least it gives you an excuse to escape from classes for a few minutes anyway. It's a real joy to be back on a university campus. It's something I enjoy the most because it's a chance to interact with people who are thinking about hard problems and looking for solutions to them. And I'm going to bring up some hard problems in the course of this discussion, and I hope I'm going to trigger some PhD level research as a consequence of the chat that we have today. So let me start out by simply giving you a bit of statistical information about the current state of the internet. I've been giving these talks for quite a while, and in the recent past, let's say in the last couple of years, it's been apparent that Asia is now the dominant user population on the internet. It's not a big surprise. China and India are part of Asia, and they certainly have very big populations. They are increasingly part of the internet environment, and you'll notice that the percentage penetration on the average is still fairly modest. It's the average around the world is 20% penetrated. The average in Asia is a little bit below that. But just imagine, as the penetration of internet in Asia reaches the same levels as it is in other parts of the world, 40, 50, 60, 70%, there's no question that our Asian colleagues will be the dominant participants in the internet. They will be the dominant source of content. Their languages, your cultures, your styles of interaction will be, in fact, the most significant part of the internet. Now, the next largest component on the internet is Europe, almost 350 million users. I've given up trying to make any guesses about Europe because they keep adding countries. So the definition of Europe is, I don't know anymore what's going to be Europe in 10 years' time. North America, the US and Canada are now number 3 on the list, whereas once upon a time they were the largest single segment on the network, and the rest are as you see them. Probably the biggest challenge in the internet universe is getting Africa up and online. Every country in Africa has some internet capability, but as you look across the continent, there are 1 billion people, and only about 40 million of them are online. The telecom infrastructure in Africa, in African countries, varies pretty dramatically, on the average still immature. And the economies of Africa vary widely. And so the affordability of internet service also varies substantially. So this is still an area of real challenge. I'm going to show you some projections of global population and regional population. The projections come from this UN report. I'm sure you don't need to write all this stuff down. I'll be sure that these slides are available, and I'll ask the university to make sure that they are known to the students and staff to get access to this. So this is where my data is coming from. If you have disagreement with the methodology for making the projections, you need to complain to the United Nations and not to me. The projections go from 1950, looking back historically, to 2,300. So it's a pretty dramatic estimate. This is an eye chart for people in the back of the room. But what you can see is that the estimates of global population, high, medium, and low estimates are between 10.6 at the high end, 7.4 at the low end, with a kind of a scary image showing that it might drop off, and 8.9, which is a slow increase up to the year 2300. I've chosen for my calculations of the year 2035 to stick with the kind of middle chart, just for simplicity. This picture is rather interesting. The parts at the bottom here represent the population of what is currently called the developed world. You'd be included in that. And it's roughly oscillating around the 1.2 billion range. The other populations vary pretty dramatically up to the year 2050. You see a massive increase in the number of people living in what are currently called less developed countries, since that will include some parts of Asia and Africa and the like. Once the year 2050 arrives, the 7.7 billion people living in those regions varies not very much, but in fact you even see it kind of dropping off. Now this is on a global scale. Let's look and see what the regional picture is like. Here's the European picture, and you see a very dramatic change in the populations. From 1950 to 2000, the population goes all the way up to nearly 800 million, and then by 2050 there's a massive drop. And the most significant drop is in the lower bar here, which represents Eastern Europe. Some of you will know that Eastern Europe is already experiencing declining population. Their fertility rate is below replacement rate, which is pretty amazing. That has all kinds of economic impact on the countries in Eastern Europe, because if they have declining populations, they have a declining workforce, which means that their economies are going to be under stress unless they bring in working populations from other parts of the world. Now, why am I showing you all this stuff when we're supposed to be talking about the internet? And the reason I wanted to show this is that if you're trying to make projections about what the internet is going to be like in 20 or 30 years' time, you have to know something about who's using it. Because it's the people who use it who will produce the information and the contents. The people who use it will determine what applications and services are of interest to them. And the people who are using it may also be the inventors of new applications on the service. So understanding which populations are part of the internet is important if you're trying to make any projections into the future. If we look at Asia, we can see again a very rapid growth between 2000 and 2050, and some decline showing up, which by around 2150 stabilizes and then begins to grow a little bit more. Once again, the interesting major variation in population comes here in this segment, and that's China. And so we're eventually seeing the effects of the Chinese population, the Chinese attempt to manage population growth. What's not being as heavily managed is India, and the Indian population, in fact, goes up quite rapidly. Up until 2050, and then you see some significant declines between 2100 and 2150 for a variety of different reasons. Now, the reason that these variations occur, the reason that you're not just seeing continued increased growth, is an interesting interplay between fertility and longevity. How long do people live? What's the mortality rate? And what is the birth rate? And those three things interact with each other in fairly complex ways, which is why you see charts like this that are not necessarily smooth. So let's imagine that it's the year 2035, and we'll ask ourselves, what's the world like? Well, one almost certain issue is that the global warming effect will have been ongoing all the way until that time for another 27 years, and of course continuing. Oil will become less and less available. Fresh water will become less and less available. Perhaps more critically, the location of populations around the world will have to change in some dramatic ways, because much of the world's population lies along the coastlines where the oceans are. And if you've listened to or watched any of the Al Gore projections, you know that a rising sea level will cause populations at the along the sea line or the coastal areas to have to move inland because of the rising sea levels. Rising sea levels have other serious implications. For example, if you have sanitation plants and the like that are trying to clean up the water, maybe even recycle the water, they can be overwhelmed by a rising sea level. The available freshwater aquifers can be overwhelmed and in fact polluted by salt entering into the freshwater systems. That can have a big impact on fresh water for drinking, for cooking, and for growing food. And so there could be many very, very significant side effects of this global warming and rising sea level. The other thing which is obviously going to happen, and it's already happening, is that fresh water will be less and less available. If you're dependent on, for example, the snowpack in the Himalayas, and the glaciers melt, then the fresh water is not going to become available through the snow melting, and as a result you'll have large populations which don't have enough fresh water. Barcelona is a city in Spain that's already has this problem. It is now importing tankers full of fresh water for the people living in Barcelona. And in some of the central parts of Spain, they're seeing desertification, more deserts being formed. The Gobi Desert is moving at the rate of a couple of miles a year, another major issue. Desalinization may be a source of water, so we can imagine in 2035 that there are major desalinization plants taking water out of the oceans and getting rid of the salt. I had a unique experience about 3 weeks ago. I was in Tokyo along with my colleague Bob Kahn as a recipient of the Japan Prize. And one of the features of the Japan Prize ceremonies is that you get to have dinner with the Emperor and the Empress of Japan. And what I didn't know until I got there is that the Emperor is in fact a scientist. He's a taxonomist, and he studies particular species of fish in the general area around Japan. And we got to talking about desalinization, and he mentioned that there is a problem with desalinization. What do you do with all the salt that you get out of the ocean? And so one answer might be, well, you pile it up in a big mountain somewhere. Another answer might be that you turn it into building material, which is apparently technically feasible. And I said, well, what about just dumping it back into the ocean again? And he pointed out that increasing the salinity of the ocean might actually have a pretty bad influence on the species of fish that could survive in the ocean if it gets overly salty. However, there was another crazy idea which didn't occur to me till after this conversation. Those of you who may know something about the way the ocean currents work may know that the reason Europe has moderately, let's say, clement winter weather is that there is an ocean current which brings warmth to northern Europe. If the glaciers melt in the northern part of the globe and put a lot of fresh water in, that current goes away. And that will translate into very severe winter months in Europe. So one answer to the desalinization question is dump the salt in the North Atlantic in order to preserve the salinity of the ocean and maintain the currents. Now, whether that's actually technically feasible, I don't have any idea. So, but the reason I bring all this stuff up is that the world that we are going to live in 2035 is going to be dramatically different from the world we're living in today for a whole lot of physical reasons. What can we do, though, with IT, information technology, to try to deal with some of the problems? Well, one example is that we can substitute IT for transportation. Instead of expending crucial fossil oil resources, we can use telecommunications systems with increasing fidelity to have meetings that we would otherwise have to meet face-to-face. So conceivably, I could have this meeting with you using a virtual Vint projected on the wall and enter exchanges with each other over the net. And in fact, increasingly, that's a common tactic. There are technologies that allow for very, very natural interactions. A company called Cisco, which I'm sure you all are familiar with, makes a service or a system that they call a telepresence system. It's a wall-sized display like this, where the projections of the people are life-size. You're sitting at a table, and you look across the table at this high-resolution screen, and you see people the same size that they are in real life. The sound system is designed to produce sound from the image that you're seeing. So when someone speaks over here, you hear them coming from over there. When you look at each other eye to eye in this system, it really looks like you're looking eye to eye, as opposed to the one where the camera is at an angle and there's a person projected on the wall and you're never really looking at each other. So it's very different experience. So I found it quite natural to use that system for communication and for a small meeting of 6 or 7 people. The only problem is that system costs about $300,000. And so that's a little more than I planned to spend in my basement. On the other hand, technologies have a tendency to get cheaper and cheaper as we build more and more of them and learn more. So my projection is that by 2035, it will be quite common to substitute this kind of virtual interaction with physical presence. The second thing which it strikes me as possible is to use IT in order to minimize the use of natural resources. We're already starting to see that happening. The companies that do overnight delivery, like FedEx and UPS and so on, are using IT algorithms to change the routes of the trucks that are either picking up or dropping off packages in real time, based on the demands that people are making in order to minimize the fuel consumption. Another thing which is happening, to go back to water shortages, I guess I mentioned that. The water tankers that are coming into Barcelona are already examples of that. Energy production and consumption is a big issue for IT. We experience this at Google because we build large-scale data centers, and they consume a substantial amount of power. They also give off a lot of heat, and we have to get rid of that heat as well. The one single thing that would make a big difference to Google in terms of its ability to do what it does would be for people to invent computers that run at very high speed at 1/10 the power that they currently do. So if there are physicists among you or hardware electronic engineers who are interested in doing something really significant, go figure out how to build a computer that doesn't use as much power as the ones today. Now, there is a tendency already to limit the amount of power consumed by computers. Those of you who have been following Moore's law will notice that the normal projection shows increasing clock speed for the computers. That's stopped. Moore's law has now leveled out in a very interesting way. The clock speed is relatively constant. The thing that's still increasing is the total amount of computer cycles available per chip. But the way that's being accomplished is to put multiple cores on the same chip. Well, this has an interesting challenge for people who run algorithms that were relying on having faster clock speeds to make the serial algorithm run faster. Now you can't rely on clock speed to do that. You have to figure out whether you can change the algorithm to run in parallel, or maybe create a pipeline for the algorithm so that although the delay goes up, the total throughput increases because you're running the stuff through a pipeline process. It's not always necessarily the case that the algorithms that you were running in serial are easily parallelized. And so this is a challenge for us and others who are heavily dependent on large-scale, high-speed computing. We have to reinvent the algorithms to run in pipeline or parallel mode. And finally, energy production is going to be a big issue in 2035. We're going to be running out of the oil and coal resources, or even if we were not, for example, we might still have plenty of coal available, but every time we build another coal-fired power plant, it generates a huge amount of carbon dioxide and exacerbates the global warming. So we're going to want to do something else, and one possibility is nuclear. There are countries like France that get almost 80% of their power requirements from nuclear power. But there's things like ethanol, and wind, solar, and geothermal. All of those are going to be more exploited by 2035. So our world is going to look significantly different. Oh, thank you. Is this vodka or just water? I've often thought that it'd be more fun to have a lecture where this is actually vodka, and the lecture gets more and more incoherent as the time goes on. So our world in 2035 is going to look pretty different from the one we're in now. Internet by that time will be 52 years old. That's assuming you start counting from the year that it was actually rolled out. It was invented in 1973, but it actually got rolled out in 1983 in January for the academic community in the United States and for some of the military. The world population by that time will be on the order of 8 billion. Assuming internet penetration at 70%, which is about as high as it is now in North America and parts of Northern Europe, that's about 5.6 billion people online. Some of the developed countries, including Singapore, will be more than 100% penetrated by internet. And you might say, well, how can that possibly be? And the arithmetic that gets done is it's like Luxembourg. I was talking to Commissioner Viviane Reding, who handles communications in the European Commission, and she very proudly said that the penetration of mobiles in Luxembourg was 150%. And I said, well, how can that be? And she said, every other Luxembourgian has 2 mobiles. So that's why it's 150%. We may very well have more than one device on the net per person in the internet of the year 2035. And in fact, I'm currently guessing, I emphasize guessing, there could be 60 billion devices on the internet, which means on the average 10 devices on the net per person. You might say, well, how can that be? And the answer is, a lot of those devices will be sensors. Some of them will be things like controlling light switches and other parts of building sensor systems, heating and ventilation and air conditioning and so on, control systems and the like, appliances around the house, appliances in the office, appliances in the car, appliances that you carry around on your body or in your purse. So we could easily imagine having a very large number of devices on the net, which, by the way, motivates the utility of IP version 6, because today's internet is based on a protocol that was standardized in 1977 called IP version 4, which only has a 32-bit address space. That means 4.3 billion unique terminations, and that's not enough. It was enough in 1977 because I thought it was an experiment. And so, I picked 32 bits. After a year of debate, I picked 32 because nobody seemed to make up their mind. And I said, look, it's 4 years into this experiment. We don't know if it's going to work. 4.3 billion termination points ought to be enough for this experiment. The thing is, the experiment never ended. And so here we are in 2008, and we need more address space. IPv6 has 128 bits of address space. That's 3.4 times 10 to the 38th. By the way, it's a joy to be in a place where I can say that and people actually understand what it means. The only other place where you can say 3.4 times 10 to the 38th is to talk to a legislature or a Congress that's accustomed to dealing with money, and they understand big numbers. Anyway, that's enough address space so that every electron in the universe can have its own web page. Except it's actually, I used to say that, and I don't anymore because I got an email from a guy in Caltech. Dear Dr. Cerf, you jerk, there's 10 to the 88th electrons in the universe and you're off by 50 orders of magnitude. So I don't say that anymore. Anyway, there's plenty of address space if we can get IPv6 deployed, and by 2035 I am pretty confident we will be running IPv6 everywhere. So the internet looks kind of like this. In 2008, 500 million devices on the net, servers on the net. 2035, 10 billion hosts on the net. By the way, there isn't any Wikipedia yet for 2035. I'm inventing one that has these statistics in it. 5.7 billion users, 6 billion broadband connections, homes and residences combined, 10 billion mobiles, and maybe 12 billion PCs. Of course, by 2035, it could be that the PC will be replaced by something else. And so this is just a wild guess. The infrastructure of the internet, the information infrastructure of the internet, in 2035 will be both wired and wireless. They'll both be higher speed. We'll be seeing speeds that exceed 1 billion bits per second for most of the high broadband wired users. And they could be in the tens to hundreds to even gigabits per second for the wireless versions as well. There will be lots and lots of interactions in the net that go from business to business. There'll be standard transactions that take place. Sometimes people refer to that as Web 2.0. I think that's a kind of marketing buzzword. But there will be enough standards so that businesses will be able to automatically interact with each other, placing orders, generating inventory requests, demanding payment, making accounts payable, and so on, creating bills of lading for shipment and the like, all automatically because of the standards that companies will use to interact with each other. I think cloud computing is going to be very common. Today it's a new term, but it's referring to an old concept. Back in the 1960s, people saw computers as very, very big, expensive things, and so they imagined that in the long-term future, the way people would use computers would be to have gigantic factories full of computers that people would access over the telecom network somehow remotely. Well, then, of course, came mini computers and microcomputers and laptops and desktops and personal digital assistants, and so computing power migrated out to the edges of the net. And people didn't think about having big computing utilities anymore until companies like Google came along and said the only way we can do what we do is to build these gigantic computer centers. So suddenly we've come full circle in 40 years' time to having gigantic computer utilities which in fact run applications on behalf of people who are remote. There's a lot of logic to this kind of architecture, because when you think about the maintenance of software, we've learned that it's not easy to maintain the software in individual and separate laptops and desktops if in fact most of them have standardized browser-style interfaces and they're interacting with software that's maintained in central computing centers. That software can actually be maintained more easily and more reliably and more uniformly than trying to maintain copies of software in every single laptop and desktop. So I think cloud computing is likely to be quite popular in the year 2035 and perhaps even before. The other thing that's important is that if you need more computing power than your laptop can supply you, even though laptops of 2035 will be enormously more powerful than the ones we have today, the cloud computing arrangement allows you to expand a computation into a much larger amount of compute power and then return that compute power to the pool to be available for other people to have this large computation. Moreover, the databases that you're working with may be so big that it would never make any sense to transport them back to the laptop. It makes more sense to transport the computation to the data and allow it to take place in the cloud and then get the answers back. I'm expecting to see a lot more collaboration in virtual environments. Some of you may be members of Second Life, and it's a kind of a crude virtual environment today. By the year 2035, those environments will probably be holographic in their character. You'll be able to interact with people very comfortably. You'll be able to initiate video conferences and things of that sort, sharing information in databases with each other in a very natural way. And even more interestingly, we can create virtual laboratories online. You walk into a virtual laboratory and you start interacting with a virtual telescope. But in fact, that virtual telescope is simply a stand-in for a real telescope somewhere else on the internet. And when you ask that telescope in the virtual space to take an image, a real telescope gets pointed to where you need to go, and you get the image and bring it back. So the idea of creating these virtual laboratories not only has a possibility for educational experiences, but it also makes it possible to control multiple instruments that are attached to the internet. So I expect that to be quite common. I'm also believing right now that today's naming and addressing environment will be dramatically different in 2035. Today, we identify host computers and endpoints with IP addresses, and they are topologically significant. So the IP address tells you something about where something is in the net. And if you attach to the internet someplace else, you need a new IP address because it's telling where you are. Then we have domain names. And in theory, the domain names will work no matter where you are in the net. You just have a different map from the domain name into the IP address. But what happens with that paradigm is that the basic identification space is of a physical device. This computer is hanging off the internet at this IP address. And the domain name is really just a stand-in for a computer that has lots of processes running and has lots of files contained inside of it. If we had unique identifiers for the files, and we had unique identifiers for the processes that are running in the machines, and those unique identifiers were independent of which machine the processes or files were on, then we could freely move processes and objects around in the internet, and it wouldn't matter which machine they were on. They have identities independent of their location. I'm convinced that by 2035, our naming and addressing spaces will be abstractions of these processes and objects, and that they will be independent of where they physically exist in the net, which means that we'll have communications going back and forth between the processes and the digital objects that are in fact mobile and can be moved from one physical machine to another, which increases their resilience to various kinds of failure. I think by the time 2035 rolls around, there will be large-scale databases, some of them sponsored by state, national, and maybe even international organizations. I can give you an example of how powerful it can be to have aggregated information available to us. At Google, we speculated that it might be possible to detect an epidemic, a health epidemic, if we knew something about the kinds of questions that people are asking of the internet contents, the web contents. In the United States, there's an organization called the Center for Disease Control, and it is responsible for detecting and reacting to things like an epidemic. Now, the way that tends to work is that doctors will report to the Center for Disease Control that a large number of patients are coming in with particular symptoms or have been diagnosed with a particular disease. But it takes the Center for Disease Control some time before they actually figure out that there's an epidemic, because they have to wait till they get reports from the doctor. So we speculated that we might be able to tell that an epidemic was underway sooner by looking to see what kinds of health questions people were asking on the internet. So we tested our theory. We looked at the dates that the Center for Disease Control in the past had announced that a certain epidemic appeared to be underway. And then we started looking at our databases of the kinds of queries and responses that had happened in the time before that date. And what we discovered is that about 30 days before the announcement of an epidemic, we could actually see people asking questions about the symptoms for that particular epidemic ahead of time. And you almost can see why that would be the case. You get sick, and you have some symptom like you're having trouble breathing or something. So if you're on the internet, you go and look to see what could cause me to have trouble breathing. And you might discover a variety of different possible causes, but then you sort of hope it'll go away. Okay, so you wait for another week, and it doesn't go away. Then you go to the doctor and you say, "Doctor, I've had this problem for a week." And the doctor says, "Okay, try this medicine, here's your problem." But the doctor doesn't know that there's an epidemic. All he knows is that a few patients have shown up. But after another week goes by, the doctor says, "Gosh, 100 people have come into my office this week with the same set of symptoms. I better report this to the Center for Disease Control." So you can see how the reporting process is a lagging indicator of this potential epidemic, whereas the querying on the internet databases is in fact a leading indicator. So we think, based on the evidence that we have so far, that we should continually monitor the kinds of health queries that are going on the net in order to detect the possibility of an epidemic somewhere in the world. Well, by 2035, I'm looking at this now from the U.S. perspective, we have an aging population. We have an increasing ethnic diversity in the country, and more people of Hispanic origin, for example. We see ourselves as in competition with India, China, Europe, and other parts of the world. Our GDP will probably be only 50% or less that of India of Asia by the year 2035. This is a big change for the United States, because historically it's always had the largest GDP of all the countries in the world, but by the time 2035 comes along, the GDPs of the rest of the world, especially Asia, will have escalated dramatically. You have big populations already, and their earning capacity will have increased substantially over the 27 years between now and then. And so the GDP will be, our average GDP in the US will be a lot less. We can't produce scientists and engineers as quickly as you can in Asia because you have a larger population from which to draw scientists and engineers. Now, I don't know whether these numbers are exactly right, and I'm sure they're not. The question is, what are the real numbers? And the U.S. has to learn that it's not going to beat anybody on the basis of numbers anymore. And so we have to learn how to live in an environment where we're no longer the most significant economy in the world. On the other hand, people in Asia are going to have to discover how to manage themselves because you are the largest economy in the world. That's a change too. So all of us are going to have to, will face a different kind of world. The physical infrastructure of that time frame will be very much affected by the availability of energy and water. And we've already talked a lot about that. Minimization of the use of water, minimization of the use of energy, reutilization of these resources, local production of power, local production of water, all very important. So we talked about a lot of these things, and I'll just leave them at that. Let's turn now to the social and economic effects of the internet in the year 2000.